The alarm tore through the chapel before I even finished my prayer. I did not open my eyes right away. 900 years of discipline taught me that panic never arrives alone, and the first breath after an alarm decides whether a person survives the next minute or not. I let that breath out slow, through my nose, the way the old sisters taught me long before this convent ever left solid ground for the black between the stars. Then I opened my eyes, and I saw the red light spinning across the stone-patterned walls of our chapel, the one Sister Agnes had built to look like the old cathedrals on Earth, back when Earth was still the only place we knew. The light did not belong here. It meant a breach, or a fire, or worse. I stood, and my robe settled around me like it always did, heavy and black, and smelling faintly of candle smoke. I have worn some version of this robe for longer than most stars burn. It has never once made me feel safe. Tonight it felt thinner than paper. Outside the chapel, sisters were already moving through the corridor, quick and quiet, the way we always moved. We do not shout. Shouting wastes air, and out here, air is not something you waste. Sister Agnes caught my arm before I passed the reliquary door. "Elara," she said, "keep your teeth where they belong tonight. We have guests." "Guests," I said. "That is a strange word for an alarm." She did not smile. Agnes rarely smiled, not because she was cruel, but because she had seen enough centuries to know that smiling too early was its own kind of foolishness. "A fleet dropped out of the dark 20 minutes ago," she said. "Human ships, refugees by the look of the damage. Half of them are venting atmosphere. The other half are asking for shelter." I felt something shift in my chest, something I did not have a name for yet. We had heard rumors of human colonies burning, whole systems stripped bare by things I will not name in a house of prayer. I had assumed those rumors were far away, the way people always assume disaster belongs to someone else, right up until it does not. "How many?" I asked. "Enough to fill our lower decks twice over," Agnes said. "Mother Superior wants every sister at the docking ring, including you." Especially me, I thought, though I did not say it. I have not been near a starving crowd of frightened humans in 3 centuries. The last time ended in a trial before the full order, a trial that nearly cost me my place among the sisters, though I broke no true rule that night, only stood too close to temptation and let everyone see how tempted I was. Since then, the Codex has watched me the way a locked door watches a key it does not trust. We walked the long corridor together, past the stained windows that showed no true sky, only the projected memory of one, painted in colors that no longer existed anywhere in the universe. I could hear my own pulse, which surprised me, because I had not needed my heart to beat with any urgency in a very long time. The docking ring smelled like burned metal and fear before we even reached it. I stepped through the final door, and the sight stopped me the way very few things still could. Rows of humans sat pressed against the walls, wrapped in blankets that were not warm enough, children asleep against the shoulders of parents who were clearly not sleeping at all. Some had bandages, some had nothing but the clothes they had been wearing when their ships broke apart around them. The air was thick with the smell of exhaustion, and beneath it, faint and constant, the smell of blood, not fresh, not spilled, just present, the way it always is in any room full of living bodies. My throat tightened in a way I had trained myself to control centuries ago, and I controlled it now, out of habit rather than effort. Mother Superior Miriam stood at the center of the ring, speaking with a human woman in a torn uniform, the captain of whatever remained of that fleet. I did not go closer. I stood near the wall instead, watching, the way I always watched before I acted. That is when I saw him. He was kneeling beside one of the ship's cracked support struts, not resting, not waiting to be told what to do, but already working, his hands moving fast over a panel of exposed wiring, while the rest of his crew simply sat and breathed. Sparks jumped near his fingers, and he did not flinch. His sleeves were pushed up past his elbows, and there was a long shallow cut along his forearm, already crusted dark, clearly hours old and completely ignored. I do not know why I crossed the docking ring toward him, instead of staying at the wall where I belonged. I told myself later it was concern for the wound, That was not entirely true. You should have that looked at, I said, before I had fully decided to speak at all. He glanced up at me without any of the reactions I was used to. No widened eyes, no step backward, no hand reaching instinctively for whatever weapon a frightened person keeps close. He looked at me the way a person looks at someone who has just walked into a room they were already expecting company in. "It is fine," he said. "I have had worse from a bad toaster." That was such an odd thing to say that I almost laughed, and I had not almost laughed in longer than I could remember. "You are bleeding," I said, because apparently I needed to say it twice. "I am also busy," he said, nodding toward the panel. "If I do not fix this line, the whole deck loses power in about 6 minutes, and 6 minutes from now, a lot of people who are already having a very bad week are going to have an even worse one." I looked past him at the crowd of exhausted humans and understood, suddenly and completely, why the Codex had never truly considered them. They were not fragile in the way our old laws assumed all outsiders to be. They were something else, something that kept working while it was bleeding. I knelt beside him without being asked, and I held the panel steady while he worked, because 4 hands were faster than 2, and because some part of me wanted a reason to stay exactly where I was. He finished the repair with 30 seconds to spare by his own count, and the lights along the deck steadied instead of flickering. He sat back on his heels and looked at me properly for the first time, taking in the robe, the pale skin, the eyes that never quite matched candlelight the way human eyes did. "You are one of them," he said, "the nuns from the old station." "I am," I said. He studied me a moment longer, not with fear, but with the plain curiosity of someone cataloging a new fact about the universe. "I heard stories about your order," he said, "vampires who took vows. I thought that was a joke someone made up to scare children on long flights." "It is not a joke," I said, "though I understand why it sounds like one." He held out his uninjured hand, which struck me as an almost absurd gesture given everything happening around us. "Owen," he said. "Owen Marsh. I keep the reactors running on whatever is left of the transport ship Halcyon, which, as of tonight, is mostly the name of a ship that used to exist." "Alara," I said, and I took his hand, which was warm in the exact way that living things are warm, a warmth I had not touched on purpose in longer than I wanted to admit. Around us, sisters were moving among the refugees with water and blankets, and Mother Superior was already organizing which decks would house which families. None of it mattered to me in that moment nearly as much as the fact that this human, bleeding and exhausted and utterly unimpressed by what I was, had simply shaken my hand as though I were an ordinary person he had met on an ordinary day. I did not know yet that this handshake would eventually put everything I was into question. I only knew that for the first time in 9 centuries, I did not want the conversation to end. Mother Superior's voice cut through the ring a moment later, calling for volunteers to escort the wounded to the infirmary deck. I stood, brushing dust from my robe, and looked down at Owen, who was already turning back to a second panel that had begun to spark. "You should let someone look at that cut," I said again, because apparently I could not help myself. "If you are offering," he said, without looking up, "I will consider it a fair trade for holding my panel steady." I did not answer him right away. I simply stood there, feeling the strange, unfamiliar pull of wanting to stay near someone I had known for less than 10 minutes, and wondering, quietly, what exactly I had just walked into. Behind me, deeper in the corridor, I heard Sister Agnes say something to another sister in a low voice. Something about the old loophole in the Codex, the one written so long ago that most sisters had forgotten it existed at all. I did not hear the whole sentence. I only caught the ending, spoken almost like a joke passed between old friends. If it is with the human, then it is not a crime. I turned to ask what she meant, but she had already moved on down the corridor, and the moment slipped past me the way most warnings do, quiet and easy to ignore, right up until they are not. The infirmary deck was quieter than the docking ring, though quiet is a strange word for a room full of injured people trying not to complain too loudly about their pain. I brought Owen there myself, mostly because Sister Agnes had vanished into the crowd before I could ask her what she meant by that strange sentence about the human and the crime, and partly because I did not trust anyone else to make sure he actually sat still long enough to be treated. He did not sit still easily. Even with a proper bandage finally wrapped around his forearm, his eyes kept drifting toward the corridor, toward the sounds of engineers arguing over which systems needed power first. I recognized that restlessness. It was the restlessness of someone who measured his own worth by how useful he could be to the people around him. "You do not have to fix everything tonight," I told him, while a young sister named Petra finished tying off the bandage. "Somebody has to," he said. "My crew is exhausted. Half of them have not slept in 2 days. If I stop working, things stop getting fixed, and things that do not get fixed on a ship tend to kill people eventually. That is a heavy thing to carry alone," I said. He looked at me sideways, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly, not quite a smile, but close enough to one that I noticed it. "You would know about carrying heavy things for a long time," he said. "How old are you exactly? If that is not too rude a question to ask a nun." 900 and some years, I said. "I stopped counting precisely a while ago. It becomes less impressive after the first 500. He let out a short laugh, surprised out of him, the kind of laugh that comes from someone who has not laughed in longer than they meant to go without it. 900 years, he said, and here I am complaining about 2 days without sleep. Exhaustion does not compare well across centuries, I told him. It is still exhaustion. It still matters. He studied me again, the same open curiosity from before, and I found myself wondering what exactly he saw when he looked at me. Most humans who learned what I was reacted in one of 2 ways. Either they backed away, quiet and careful, treating me like something that might strike without warning, or they leaned in too eagerly, drawn by rumor and legend, wanting a story instead of a person. Owen did neither. He simply looked at me the way he had looked at that sparking panel, like a problem worth understanding properly before deciding what to do about it. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You may. Do you actually need blood?" he asked. "Or is that part of the old stories too?" "I need it," I said, "though not the way the old stories claim. I do not need to take a life to survive. I need very little, and I have gone centuries at a time on almost nothing at all, sustained mostly by the blood offered freely within our own order, sisters who share what they can spare, the way any family shares what it can spare with the members who need it most." "That sounds lonely," he said. I had never thought of it as lonely before that moment. It had always simply been the shape of my life, unremarkable, because it was the only shape I had ever known. "It is the vow," I said. "We do not take from the unwilling. We do not take from outsiders at all, willing or not. It has been that way since before either of us existed in any form worth mentioning." "Why not from outsiders?" he asked. "If someone is willing, what does it matter?" "Because willingness is complicated," I said. "Because outsiders do not always understand what they are offering, and because our order decided, long ago, that the safest rule was the simplest one. No outsiders. No exceptions." He was quiet for a moment, turning his bandaged arm over in his lap, considering something. "Then I am offering," he said, plainly, like a man setting down a tool he had finished using. "Not because I am afraid of you and want to buy safety. Not because I think it will make a good story to tell later. Just because you held my panel steady when you did not have to, and because you have been more decent to me in the last hour than most of my own fleet's command staff have been in the last 2 days, and if that is worth something to you, then it is yours." I felt something in my chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with hunger, and everything to do with how plainly he had said it, as though offering a piece of himself to a 900-year-old vampire was simply a fair transaction between 2 tired people who had helped each other through a difficult night. "I cannot accept that," I said, though the words came out softer than I intended. "Cannot or will not?" he asked. "Both," I said. "It would break my vow. And even if it would not, I do not think I should take something offered so easily, without you understanding what it truly means to give it." "Then explain it to me," he said. I am not going anywhere. My ship does not exist anymore. Remember, I have time. So I told him, sitting there in the quiet infirmary while sisters moved between cots around us, about the vow that bound my order, about the centuries of discipline that had shaped every part of how I lived, about the trial I had faced 300 years ago when I had let myself stand too close to temptation and nearly lost everything because of it. I told him about the strange comfort of rules, how they had kept me steady through ages when everything else in the universe kept shifting and dying and being replaced. He listened the way few people ever truly listen, without interrupting, without rushing to fill silence with his own opinions, simply absorbing what I said and turning it over carefully before responding. "That sounds like a very safe way to live," he said finally. "It also sounds like it has cost you almost everything worth having." I did not answer that right away, because I did not know how to argue with it. "My people are not big on safe rules," he continued. "We are the kind of species that builds ships knowing some of them will break apart, because the alternative is staying home and never finding out what else is out there. I am not saying your vow is wrong. I am saying it might be built for a world that does not fully exist anymore, now that people like me are part of it." Sister Agnes's words returned to me then, unbidden, the strange fragment I had overheard in the corridor. "If it is with the human, then it is not a crime." I asked him to wait a moment, and I found Agnes near the supply stores, sorting bandages with quick, practiced hands. "What did you mean," I asked, "by that sentence in the corridor?" She did not look up right away, continuing to fold gauze into neat squares. "It is an old clause," she said, "written into the earliest version of our codex, back when humans were considered too new and too strange for the Order's founders to properly account for. The founders assumed humans would never matter enough to test it. They wrote it almost as a joke, a technicality, a loophole meant to gather dust. But it is real," I said. "It is written," she said. "Whether it was ever meant to be used is a different question entirely." "What does it mean, exactly?" I asked. "It means the old prohibition against feeding on outsiders was written specifically against species known to the Order at the time of its founding," she said. "Humans came later enough that the founders never formally added them to the forbidden list. Some sisters argue the omission was deliberate, a quiet mercy toward a young species. Others argue it was simple oversight, and that oversight should be corrected the moment anyone tries to use it." "Which do you believe?" I asked. She finally looked up at me, and her expression was not unkind, but it was careful, the expression of someone who had watched too many young sisters make choices they later regretted. "I believe it does not matter what I believe," she said. "What matters is what you decide to do with it. A loophole is not an invitation, Ilara. It is only a door left slightly open. Whether you walk through it is entirely your own choice, and entirely your own risk." I returned to the infirmary and found Owen exactly where I had left him, patient in a way that surprised me every time I noticed it. "I spoke with one of my sisters," I said. "There may be an old exception in our law, one that was never meant to be tested, but exists nonetheless." "And?" he asked. "And I do not know yet what I intend to do with it," I said. "But I wanted you to know it exists, since it concerns you as much as it concerns me." He considered this, turning it over the way he turned over every problem presented to him. "Then we will figure it out together," he said, as if that were the simplest and most obvious solution in the world. "You are not the only one allowed to decide what happens here, Ilara. If this concerns me too, then I get a say in it as well." I had not expected that, though I am not sure why. He had shown me, in the span of a single night, that he was not the kind of person who waited quietly to be told what his own life meant. It should not have surprised me that he would want a voice in mine as well. Outside the infirmary, the corridor lights flickered once, steadied, and settled into the low golden hum that meant the deck had finally stabilized for the night. Somewhere beyond these walls, an entire fleet of frightened, exhausted humans was learning to breathe again inside a convent that had never before opened its doors this wide to strangers. I did not know yet how much that open door would cost. I only knew, sitting there across from a man who had offered me a piece of himself without a moment's hesitation, that I did not want to close it. Word travels fast inside a convent, even one large enough to hold a dozen decks and 1,000 years of history. By the third day after the fleet's arrival, I could feel the weight of unspoken opinions following me through every corridor I walked. Sister Petra was the first to say anything directly, catching me near the herb stores where I had gone to collect supplies for the infirmary. Supplies that gave me an excuse to walk past the deck where Owen and his crew had been assigned quarters. "You have been spending a great deal of time near the human engineer," she said, not unkindly, but carefully, the way one might mention a small crack noticed in an otherwise solid wall. "He is repairing systems that keep this convent's lower decks breathing properly," I said. "It would be strange if I did not spend time near the person doing that work." Petra smiled the way someone smiles when they do not entirely believe the answer they have been given, but do not wish to argue about it yet. "Just be careful," she said. "Some of the older sisters remember what happened 3 centuries ago. They do not want to see that trial repeated." "I remember it too," I said. "Better than anyone, since I was the one standing before the order that night." She left it there, and I let her, though her warning followed me the rest of that day like a shadow that would not quite fall away. I found Owen exactly where I expected, deep in the engineering deck, surrounded by 3 of his crew members and a wall of exposed conduit that looked like it had been fighting back against every repair attempt made so far. "You look like a woman who has just been given careful advice she does not intend to take," he said without looking up from his work. "That is an alarmingly accurate guess," I said. He glanced at me then, setting down his tool, and gestured for me to sit on the crate beside him, which I did, because by that point I had stopped pretending I needed a formal reason to be near him. "My sisters worry," I said, "about what closeness with you might mean, about whether it tests our vow in ways that could cost me more than I am prepared to lose." "Do you think it does?" he asked. "I do not know," I said. "That is the honest answer. I have spent 900 years inside rules clear enough that I never needed to ask myself that question before." He considered this for a long moment, wiping grease from his hands with a cloth that had clearly seen better days. "Can I tell you something my grandmother used to say?" he asked. "Please," I said. "She used to tell me that rules built to protect people sometimes outlive the reason they were built for," he said. "Not because the reason was wrong, but because the world around the reason kept changing while the rules stayed exactly the same." She said the hardest thing in life is telling the difference between a rule still worth keeping and one that has simply outlived its purpose. "That sounds like wisdom earned through hard experience," I said. "She buried 3 husbands and rebuilt a farm twice after storms took it apart," he said. "She earned the right to say things like that." I found myself smiling, an expression that still felt slightly unfamiliar on my face after so many centuries of careful composure. Over the following days, I began testing the space between us, the way a person tests ice, before deciding whether it will hold their weight. Small things, nothing that any sister could point to directly and call improper. I brought him meals during his longer shifts, sitting beside him while he ate, the 2 of us talking about nothing important and everything at once. I took a turn standing watch with him during the deep night hours, when the convent's corridors were quietest and the stars outside the reinforced windows looked close enough to touch. He told me about his life before the fleet, about a childhood spent fixing machines on a farm not unlike his grandmother's, about a sister back on a world he would likely never see again, about dreams that had nothing to do with vampires or convents or ancient vows, dreams that were simply human and small and precious in exactly the way small things become precious once you understand how easily they can be lost. I told him things I had not spoken aloud in centuries, about the sisters I had outlived, about the strange grief of watching mortal friends grow old and pass while I remained exactly as I had always been, about the quiet fear, buried so deep I had almost forgotten it was there, that perhaps I had chosen this vow not out of devotion, but out of safety, because loving anything that could die felt like a wound I did not know how to survive twice. He did not try to fix that fear the way he fixed broken conduits. He simply sat with it, the way he had sat with me, present and steady, and somehow that was enough. It was Sister Agnes who finally confronted me directly, nearly 2 weeks after the fleet's arrival, finding me in the chapel during the hour usually reserved for quiet reflection. "You are testing the loophole," she said, sitting beside me on the old wooden bench. "I am testing myself," I said, "whether what I feel is truly permitted, or whether I have simply found a clever excuse to want something I should not." "And which is it?" she asked. "I do not know yet," I said honestly, "but I know that every time I am near him, I feel less like someone reciting a vow from memory, and more like someone choosing it freshly, on purpose, every single day." I did not expect that a loophole meant as a joke could make an old vow feel new again. Agnes studied me for a long moment, her expression unreadable in the candlelight. "Be careful what you are choosing, Alara," she said. "The Mother Superior has noticed as well. She has said nothing yet, but silence from her is rarely permanent." I understood the warning for what it was, though I did not yet know how soon it would matter. 3 nights later, disaster arrived in a form none of us had anticipated. A power surge tore through the convent's ancient core systems, the same systems that had kept our order alive and hidden for centuries, systems now strained beyond their original design by the sudden addition of an entire refugee fleet's worth of extra bodies drawing on limited resources. Alarms sounded through every deck, far louder and far more urgent than the one that had first announced the fleet's arrival. I found Owen already in the deepest engineering chamber, working alongside 2 of the convent's own engineers, sisters who had spent centuries learning systems that Owen had only known for 2 weeks and yet somehow already understood as well as they did. "The core is failing," he said the moment he saw me, not with panic, but with the flat clarity of a man who had already begun calculating solutions before the problem had even finished announcing itself. "If we do not stabilize it within the hour, this whole convent loses life support. Every deck, every corridor, every person on board, human and sister alike." "What do you need?" I asked. "Hands that do not tire," he said, "and someone who is not afraid to work close, to live current for longer than a normal person could survive doing it safely." I understood immediately what he was asking, though he had not asked it directly. "I am not afraid of that," I said. "Then help me hold this open," he said, gesturing toward a section of exposed conduit crackling with dangerous current. "My crew needs a break in shifts." "You do not." I worked beside him through that hour, holding steady what needed to be held, absorbing shocks that would have injured or killed an ordinary person, feeling my own unusual endurance become useful in a way it rarely was inside the quiet, careful walls of the convent. It was strange, working shoulder to shoulder with a human who treated my strength not as something frightening, but simply as another tool suited to the job at hand, no different than his own steady hands or quick calculations. We stabilized the core with barely minutes to spare, and when the alarms finally fell silent, Owen sat back against the wall, exhausted in the ordinary human way that I could never fully share, and looked at me with something in his expression I had not seen there before. "You just saved this entire convent," he said. "We saved it," I said, "together." He nodded, too tired to argue the point, and closed his eyes for a moment, letting himself simply breathe. It was in that quiet moment, in the aftermath of shared danger and shared relief, that I understood something I had been avoiding understanding for 2 weeks. Whatever this was between us, it was no longer a question I could answer by testing small, careful moments one at a time. It had already grown into something that would soon demand a real decision, one way or another, whether I was ready to make it or not. I did not know yet that the decision would be forced upon me sooner than I expected, and by someone whose authority I could not simply argue past the way I had argued past Sister Agnes's careful warnings. Mother Superior Miriam was waiting for me outside the engineering deck when I finally emerged, her expression calm in the particular way that always meant she had already made up her mind about something important, and was simply waiting for the right moment to say it aloud. "Walk with me, Alara," she said. "We need to speak about what is happening between you and the human engineer before it becomes something neither of us can undo." I followed Mother Superior Miriam through corridors that suddenly felt narrower than I remembered, past the chapel with its painted stars, past the reliquary door where Sister Agnes had first warned me about teeth and guests, until we reached her private study, a small stone room lined with texts older than most civilizations still standing anywhere in the galaxy. "Sit," she said, and I sat, though every instinct told me this conversation would be easier to survive standing. She did not sit across from me right away. Instead, she stood near the narrow window, looking out at the false projected stars, her hands folded behind her back in the posture she always took when preparing to say something difficult. "I have watched you for 2 weeks," she said. "I have watched you bring him meals. I have watched you stand watch beside him through the deep night hours. I have watched you work beside him tonight, in a chamber full of dangerous current, risking yourself in a way you have not risked yourself for any of your own sisters in longer than I can easily recall." "I did what was needed to save the convent," I said. "You did what you wanted to do," she said, turning to face me. "And I am not condemning that wanting, Alara. I am simply naming it plainly, because I think you have been avoiding naming it plainly yourself." I did not answer, because I did not have an honest answer ready. "Sister Agnes tells me you have been testing an old clause," she continued. "The one about outsiders your kind may once have overlooked. Tell me honestly, do you believe that clause was written to permit what is growing between you and this human?" "I believe the clause exists," I said. "Whether it was written for this purpose or simply forgotten by accident, I do not know. I only know that it is real, and that I have not yet broken any rule written in our codex." "The letter of the law," she said, not unkindly. "But you already know that our order has never survived on the letter of the law alone, Ilara. We have survived because every sister understood the spirit behind each rule, and honored that spirit even when a clever exception might have technically permitted otherwise." "Then tell me plainly what you believe the spirit of that clause to be," I said, "because I truly do not know, and I would rather hear it from you than guess wrongly and pay for the mistake later." She was quiet for a long moment, considering her words with the same careful weight she gave to everything. "I believe our founders did not anticipate humans mattering enough to require a rule against them," she said finally. "Not because humans were unworthy of one, but because in their time, humans were a young, scattered species unlikely to ever cross paths with our order in any meaningful way. The omission was not mercy, Alara. It was oversight, born of a world that no longer exists. And I believe that if our founders could see what you are building with this man, they would have closed that door immediately, the same way I am asking you to close it now." I felt something in my chest tighten painfully at her words, not because I doubted her sincerity, but because some quiet part of me had already begun hoping she might see it differently. "What are you asking of me?" I said. "I am asking you to end this," she said. "Before it becomes something that forces the whole order to take a position none of us are prepared to defend. I am not asking out of cruelty. I am asking because I have watched sisters lose themselves to attachments that end in grief, and I do not wish to watch it happen to you again, not after what the last one cost you." "And if I refuse," I asked. "Then you will face the order formally," she said, "as you did 3 centuries ago. And this time, Ilara, I cannot promise the outcome will favor you the way it did then. The Codex is old, but it is not without teeth of its own." I left her study with no clear answer given, only a heavy silence that felt like its own kind of answer, one I was not yet ready to accept. I found myself walking toward the engineering deck without fully deciding to go there, my feet carrying me toward Owen the way they always did whenever I needed to think clearly about something difficult. I told myself I was simply going to say goodbye, to end things quietly and cleanly, before they could grow into the kind of conflict that might tear the convent apart from the inside. He was alone when I found him, finally resting after the long crisis of the core failure, sitting on the same crate where we had first truly talked, turning a small tool over in his hands without really using it, simply needing something to hold. "You look like someone carrying bad news," he said, the moment he saw my face. "Mother Superior wants this ended," I said, sitting beside him without being invited, because by now, neither of us needed formal invitations anymore. She believes the loophole was never meant to permit what is growing between us. She has given me a choice: end it quietly or face the order formally, the same trial that nearly ended everything for me 3 centuries ago. He set the tool down carefully, giving me his full attention in the way he always did when something truly mattered. "And what do you want to do?" he asked. "That is exactly the question I do not know how to answer," I said. "I have spent 900 years being certain about almost everything. I do not know how to be uncertain about something this important and still function properly." He was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was steady in a way that surprised me, considering everything he had already lost in the last few weeks. "I never asked you to risk anything for me," he said. "Not the trial, not your place among your sisters, not 900 years of a life you built carefully before I ever existed in it. If ending this protects what you have built, then maybe it is the right choice, even if it does not feel like one right now." That should have made the decision easier. Instead, it made it harder, because I understood, hearing him say it so plainly, exactly why I did not want to let him go. "That is exactly why I do not want to end it," I said, "because you have never once asked me for anything. Not blood, not safety, not comfort at my expense. Everything you have offered me, you offered freely, without condition, the same way you offered your blood on the first night we met, expecting nothing in return except honesty about what it truly meant." He reached out then and took my hand, the same warm, living warmth I had noticed the very first time we touched, and I let him hold it, feeling 9 centuries of careful discipline settle into something quieter and more certain than discipline had ever managed to feel before. Before either of us could say anything more, the deck alarm sounded again, sharper and more urgent than the power failure had been, a pattern I recognized immediately as the signal for an approaching external threat rather than an internal system failure. Owen was on his feet instantly, moving toward the nearest console, and I followed him, my own uncertainty pushed aside by the sudden clarity that danger always seemed to bring. "Sensors are picking up a fleet signature," he said, reading the display quickly, his voice tightening with recognition. "The same signature that hit our colony before the Halcyon ever launched. Whatever destroyed my homeworld, Ilara, it just found us here." I looked past him at the display, at the cluster of hostile signatures closing steadily toward our position, and understood immediately that whatever conversation Mother Superior and I still needed to finish would have to wait, because an entire convent full of sisters and an entire fleet full of desperate human refugees were about to be tested by something far more dangerous than any old clause buried inside a forgotten codex. "How long until they reach us?" I asked. "Less than an hour," he said, already moving toward the door, already thinking 3 steps ahead, the way he always did when a crisis demanded it. "And our shields are still running on backup power from the core failure. We are not ready for this." "Then we had better get ready," I said, and for the first time since Mother Superior had given me her ultimatum, I felt something close to certainty settle over me, sharp and clear. Whatever the order decided about my vow, whatever punishment waited for me once this immediate danger passed, I understood one thing without any doubt at all. I was not going to let anything, human enemy or ancient rule, take him from me without a fight first. We ran together toward the command deck, alarms echoing around us, and somewhere behind me, I heard Mother Superior's voice calling my name through the corridor, urgent now in a way it had not been in her quiet study only minutes before. The choice she had asked me to make would have to wait a little longer. Survival came first. Everything else, including whatever I truly was to Owen Marsh, would have to be decided in whatever time we had left once this threat was finally answered. The command deck was chaos by the time we arrived, sisters and human officers working side by side at consoles never designed to host both at once, voices overlapping in urgent, clipped sentences as everyone tried to understand exactly what was bearing down on us. Mother Superior stood at the center of it, her earlier calm replaced by the focused intensity of someone who had led this order through crises far older than tonight's. She looked up as Owen and I entered together, and whatever she had planned to say to me in that quiet study clearly moved aside in her mind to make room for the more immediate danger. "Report," she said, looking between the human captain and her own senior sisters. "The hostile fleet matches the signature that destroyed the Halcyons' home colony," the human captain said, her voice tight but controlled. "6 vessels, heavily armed, moving in an attack formation we have seen before. We barely escaped them once already. I do not know if we can survive a second encounter, especially not with our own systems still recovering from tonight's power failure. Our shields are at 40%, one of the senior sisters added. The convent was never designed for combat. We built this place to hide, not to fight." "Then we do not fight the way they expect us to," Owen said, stepping forward before anyone could stop him, and I felt a flicker of pride mixed with fear at the sight of him speaking plainly to an entire command deck full of ancient authority, as though he belonged there as much as anyone. "Explain," Mother Superior said, her attention sharpening on him. "Their formation depends on overwhelming a target's shields quickly, before that target can reroute power intelligently," he said. "I have seen their attack pattern before, back when they hit our colony. If we can consolidate power from every non-essential system into the shields the moment they engage, we can absorb the first wave long enough to strike back before they expect resistance. That would require pulling power from life support across most of the lower decks," one of the senior sisters said. "We cannot leave that many people without air for the length of time such a maneuver would require." "I can hold the life support system stable manually," I said, the words leaving me before I had fully finished the thought. "My body does not require the same margins yours do. I do not need to breathe the way the rest of you do, not urgently, not for the length of time this crisis will last. Let me hold those systems together by hand while every other resource goes to the shields." Mother Superior looked at me for a long moment, and I understood she was weighing far more than tactics in that gaze. She was weighing the very question she had asked me to resolve only an hour earlier, watching me offer myself for a plan built entirely around trusting a human's judgment completely. "Do it," she said finally. "Whatever else must be decided tonight, it will wait until everyone aboard this convent is still alive to argue about it." What followed was the longest hour I had experienced in centuries, and I have lived through supernovas and empires collapsing into dust. I positioned myself deep in the lower decks, working alongside 2 sisters to manually stabilize failing life support conduits, holding open circuits with my bare hands the way I had done during the earlier crisis, absorbing shocks and strain that would have crippled an ordinary person within minutes. Above me, throughout the convent, every available system fed its power toward the shields, exactly as Owen had calculated. I could hear the distant shudder of the convent's hull as the hostile fleet's first assault struck home, could feel the vibration travel down through the deck plating beneath my feet, and I forced myself to remain steady, holding the fragile lines of breathable air together for people I had sworn, centuries ago, to protect above all else. Through the comm channel patched into my earpiece, I could hear Owen's voice directing the counterstrike, calm even as the convent shuddered around him, calling out corrections and adjustments with the same steady confidence he had shown fixing that first sparking panel on the night we met. "Shields holding at 18%, he said. "Redirecting reserve power now. Ilara, how long can you hold life support at this level?" "As long as this crisis requires," I said through gritted teeth, feeling current burn against skin that healed almost as quickly as it was wounded, though not quite quickly enough to make the pain disappear entirely. The second wave of the enemy assault struck harder than the first, and for one terrible moment, every light on the deck around me flickered and died completely, plunging the corridor into total darkness broken only by the faint glow of emergency strips along the floor. I heard sisters gasp around me, heard a child crying somewhere on a deck below, and I held the conduit steadier, forcing broken connections back into alignment through sheer stubborn will, refusing to let this be the moment everything finally failed. Lights returned a heartbeat later, and Owen's voice came through the comm again, sharper now with barely restrained excitement. "Their formation just broke," he said. "They did not expect us to hold this long. They are pulling back to regroup. Now is our chance. Redirect everything we have left into a single strike along their weakened flank. I heard Mother Superior's voice give the order, heard the convent's ancient weapon systems, rarely used in longer than most sisters could remember, finally fire in earnest, and moments later, the trembling in the deck plating beneath me stilled into something closer to peace. "They are retreating," Owen said, his voice unsteady now, not with fear, but with the disbelieving relief of someone who had genuinely not expected to survive the last hour. "They are actually retreating." I released the conduit I had been holding, my hands finally shaking now that the immediate danger had passed, and allowed myself for the first time in that entire hour to simply breathe. By the time I made my way back up to the command deck, the mood had shifted entirely, exhaustion and disbelief replacing the sharp fear that had gripped everyone only an hour before. Sisters and human officers alike stood in loose clusters, some embracing, some simply sitting wherever they had collapsed, too tired to move further. Owen found me first, crossing the deck quickly despite his own obvious exhaustion, and for a moment, neither of us said anything at all, simply standing close enough to feel the other's presence after an hour spent uncertain whether either of us would survive it. "You held an entire deck's life support together with your bare hands," he said finally, something like awe mixed into his exhausted voice. "You held an entire defense plan together with nothing but calculations and nerve," I said. "I think we are even." Mother Superior approached us then, and the command deck around us grew quieter, sisters and human officers alike sensing that something important was about to be said. "Tonight, this convent survived because of a plan built by a human engineer," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the deck, "and because one of my own sisters trusted that plan enough to risk her own body holding it together. I called Alara to my study only hours ago and asked her to end whatever was growing between her and this man, believing it threatened everything our order stands for." She paused, looking directly at me now, and I felt every eye on that deck settle on the two of us as well. "I was wrong," she said simply, "not about the danger such closeness carries. Attachment has always been dangerous for our kind, and I do not say this lightly, but I was wrong to believe that danger alone made it a mistake. Tonight, that attachment saved every life aboard this convent. I cannot in good conscience call that a crime. I felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight for 2 weeks, tight in some ways for 900 years. "Then you believe the loophole was rightly written after all," I said quietly. "I believe," she said, choosing her words with obvious care, "that our founders left a door open they did not fully understand the meaning of, and that sometimes the wisest thing an old order can do is trust that a door left open for good reason should perhaps remain open a while longer, rather than closing it simply because closing it feels safer." She turned and walked away without waiting for a response, leaving Owen and me standing together amid the quiet aftermath of survival, and I understood that whatever formal conversations might still follow in the days ahead, the immediate danger, both the danger of the enemy fleet and the danger of losing him to an old rule, had passed for tonight. Later, once the convent had settled back into something resembling calm, once the wounded had been tended, and the frightened had finally been allowed to rest, I found Owen alone on a small observation deck overlooking the false projected stars, the same gentle imitation of a sky that had comforted generations of sisters who would never again see a true one. "I have been thinking about what you offered me, the very first night we met," I said, sitting beside him. "The blood," he said, without hesitation, as though he had been waiting for this conversation as long as I had been avoiding it. "Yes," I said. "I refused it then because I did not understand what accepting it truly meant. I understand it now." He turned to look at me fully, his expression open in a way that held none of the fear I had grown so used to seeing in others who learned what I was. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Not because I am afraid to offer it again, because I need to know that whatever happens next, you are choosing it clearly, not simply because tonight was frightening and you want comfort from it. I have spent 900 years being certain about rules," I said. "I would like, just once, to be certain about something chosen freely instead. He offered his hand, palm turned upward, the same simple gesture he had made the very first night we met, and this time I did not hesitate the way I had then. What passed between us in that quiet moment was gentle, careful, and entirely without the desperation or danger the old stories always imagined such things to carry. It was, more than anything else, an act of trust freely given and freely received, exactly the kind of exchange our codex had never truly imagined when it was written so long ago for a world that had not yet learned humans could matter this much. When it was finished, I felt something settle inside me that I had not felt in longer than I could properly measure, a quiet certainty that had nothing to do with old vows or ancient rules, and everything to do with a choice made plainly, in the open, with nothing hidden and nothing to fear. Sister Agnes found us there some time later, and if she noticed anything different about the ease between us, she said nothing of it, only settled onto the bench nearby and looked out at the false stars alongside us. "The Order is already arguing about what tonight means for the old codex," she said. "Some sisters believe the loophole should finally be closed, now that it has clearly been tested. Others believe tonight proved exactly why it should remain." "And what do you believe?" I asked, echoing the question I had once asked her in the supply stores, weeks that felt like a lifetime ago. She considered it for a long moment, the same careful weighing she gave everything worth deciding properly. "I believe some rules exist to protect us from real danger," she said, "and I believe others simply exist because no one ever thought to ask whether the world they were written for still resembles the world we actually live in now. Tonight, Alara, you did not break our Order's law. You simply proved it was never big enough to properly contain what you found." I looked at Owen then, exhausted and quietly content beside me, a human who had walked into my life during a crisis and had somehow, without ever asking for it, taught 900 years of careful discipline to make room for something it had never properly accounted for. The codex would go on being debated, I knew, long after tonight, long after this crisis, perhaps long after every sister currently arguing about it had finally passed from the universe entirely. Rules like ours rarely change quickly, and perhaps they should not, given how much depends on them holding steady through centuries no single person could survive alone. But some things, I had learned, did not need an ancient order's permission to be true. Some choices simply needed to be made plainly, honestly, and without hiding behind whatever clever exception happened to make them easier to defend. "If it is with the human, then it is not a crime," Sister Agnes had once said, half as a joke, passed quietly between old friends who never expected it to matter. I understood now that she had been right, though not for the reason the old clause had ever intended. It was not the loophole that made this choice permissible. It was simply the truth of it, plain and undeniable, sitting quietly beside me under a sky that had never been real, holding a hand that was. Whatever came next, whatever the Order finally decided about vows written too long ago for a world too different from the one we now lived in, I knew I would face it exactly the way Owen had faced every crisis since the night we met, not with certainty about the outcome, but with steady hands, clear eyes, and the quiet conviction that some things were worth risking everything to protect. The stars outside remained false, painted light against old stone, but for the first time in 900 years, I did not need them to be real. I only needed this, a hand in mine, a choice made freely, and the simple, hard-won knowledge that love, however dangerous, however old the rules against it, had never once been the crime anyone claimed it was.